If you would, turn your attention today, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, beginning with verse 15 down through verse 18. You'll notice these words. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 15. Notice, "For all things are for your sakes, that grace, having spread through the many, may cause thanksgiving to abound to the glory of God. Therefore we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal." Now let me read that as well in the Message version of the scriptures. Notice verse 15. "Every detail works to your advantage and to God's glory. More and more grace, more and more people, more and more praise. So we're not giving up. How could we? Even though on the outside it often looks like things are falling apart on us. On the inside, where God is making new life, not a day goes by without His unfolding grace. These hard times are small potatoes compared to the coming good times, the lavish celebration prepared for us. There's far more here than meets the eye. The things we see now are here today, gone tomorrow. But the things we can't see now will last forever." And I'm talking today from the subject, turn minutes into moments. Turn minutes into moments. Moments, when you think about it in terms of just the definition of what a moment is a specific point in time. It is a specific point in time. It's a moment. Sometimes a person will have this, sometimes it's a hormonal reaction, and then they'll just say, "I had a moment." It could be a flashback of a memory, and then they said, "I had a moment." But also a moment is a particular period of importance, influence, or significance in a series of events or developments. It's interesting whether when you have a moment, it's almost like a toddler taking his first steps, a little girl's first day to school. It's like your graduation, that creates a moment. How do you live your life where your life is not just a collection of minutes, just you're casually doing the time, watching time pass by? How do you create a minute? For this thing that we're going through right now, it's this light affliction. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church at Corinth, was saying, is but for a moment. It's but for a moment. And I want to admonish you today, don't miss the moment. Don't miss the moment. Tell somebody next to you, don't miss the moment. The word moment comes from the Latin word that means momentum. The Latin word momentum. When you said the word moment, it comes from momentum. When you are in a moment, it means that there is momentum that is connected with that. Momentum always has to do with movement. Momentum, it always has to do with movement. So whenever you're having a moment, it's sort of like you're freezing a frame in time with something that is moving. You know how a film is made from a series of still shots. And so when you have a moment, you capture a snapshot instead of the fluidity of the film just going by. You take it and you create a moment. And let me say this, that a minute is minute. It's just a tiny measure of time. A minute, it is minute. It's a tiny measure of time, just a minute. And the great tragedy of life is to just pass the minutes and miss the moments. Why would we want to just pass the minutes and miss the moments? Don't miss the moments. Don't miss the moments of your life. And so I want to talk to you today about how do you turn minutes into moments? How do you turn minutes into moments? When we create a moment, we essentially build what I would call a monument, because we are building a monument in time. The word monument comes from the Latin word monumentum, which means memorial. It means memorial. When you create a monument, it is a memorial. And that further comes from the word that simply means to remind. What do you create in your life to remind you of something exceptional that God has done? Don't just live life as a collection of minutes. You've got to be able to celebrate the unique moments where you create a freeze frame. In this momentum of life, of what we call life, you freeze the frame so that you don't just pass by this thing. When God does something significant for you, there should be a divine Selah. The Selah says, don't take this for granted. Don't take this lightly. The Selah says, stop and reflect on this. Think about God's goodness and His incredible grace. He didn't have to raise you up from the sick bed. He didn't have to prevent the automobile accident. He didn't have to send your child back home. He didn't have to bless you with a job. God, when He does something, don't just run through life. Stop and take a divine Selah. You are creating a monument in time, a place of memorial where you remember what the Lord has done. You remember what the Lord has done. Any scar that is on your body, it is a sign that something happened and you healed. You ought to think about it. You ought to think about it. Every scar, there are some emotional scars that are on your heart. And it says something happened, but I healed. It didn't take me out. I'm still here. It's there. Every scar can become a place of memorial for you, where you celebrate a moment of something that has happened. And so creating this moment, it freezes a time in the movement or the momentum of life. And so we want to be very careful about being able to create that monument, that moment that freezes the frame in the movement or the momentum of life. And most people, you know, who were alive and old enough to understand what was going on, they can remember exactly where they were and what they were doing when unique events happened in the world. I mean, when they heard the news, people that were alive during the time of when World War II ended, and when they heard the broadcast that the war is over, people remember where they were and they remembered what they were doing. You know why? Because it created a moment for them. When J.F. Kennedy was shot, it created a moment. Most people who were alive and old enough to understand what was going on, they remember where they were and what they were doing. Most people, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, they remembered where they were and what they were doing when they heard the news. Most people who were alive and old enough to remember, they remember where they were and what they were doing when 9/11 happened. Because it created a moment. It created a moment. So there are different things that happen, but my question is, why is it that most of our mental monuments are over something tragic? They don't have to be. Who wants a memorial of all of the tragic things? Who wants to be reminded of pain and tragedy? And I know that there is a place for that, but don't let it be exclusively pain. I mean, you know, when we sing the song, I've had some good days. You know, you had some good days, you had some bad days. So don't let them be all bad days. Don't let it be all tragedy. We want to be able to remember some good stuff and some blessings and some highlights in our life. Because whenever you have discomfort or tragedy in your life, It ought to be a light affliction, which is but for a moment, but it shouldn't be a lifestyle. It should never be a lifestyle. And so we need to erect some positive monuments, places of memorial, something that is designed to remind us of the grace of God in our life, how faithful God has been. I mean, it creates a mental monument. You turn a minute into a moment whenever you open your first business. You turn a minute into a moment whenever you write your first book. You turn a minute into a moment when you get your first job. You turn a minute into a moment when you, as a doctor, when you see your first patient. You turn a minute into a moment when you buy your first car. Everybody can remember buying their first car. We turn a minute into a moment when we celebrate the lives of those who have sacrificed for us. You turn a minute into a moment when you get married. You turn a minute into a moment when you have your first child. You turn a minute into a moment when you graduate from school or when you get an advanced degree. You turn a minute into a big moment when you give your life to Jesus. You turn a minute into a great moment when you discover the very reason, the very purpose for which you were born. And you turn a minute into a moment whenever you pass the baton to somebody else that you have developed. You can turn a minute into a moment. Don't just live life and let the minutes pass and you never create moments, because life is a collection of moments. Life, it is a collection of moments. And so you have to do something worth remembering. I mean, if you have oatmeal for breakfast every morning, nothing is memorable about that. I mean, you know, I understand that it helps to lower your cholesterol, but it's not the most exciting breakfast. If you want something to really celebrate, you know, have you some French toast with some powdered sugar on it and some maple syrup and some shrimp etouffee over some grits. I mean, you don't live but once. You know, every now and then you need to have something that just make you remember. It's like, now that was a breakfast. You need to create some moments in your life, because I want to say this to you: life is too short to allow anyone to waste your moments. Life is too short to allow anybody to waste your moments. In fact, can I say something to you for just a moment? If you let somebody waste 10 minutes of your time, 8 minutes of those were your fault. No, I mean, I'm serious. You know, because, you know, it doesn't take you, I mean, if you got halfway decent common sense, people talk to you for 2 minutes, you know, in about 2 minutes whether this is some foolishness or whether I want to be involved in this or not, or you know what, you wasting your time, and more importantly, you wasting. So you give somebody 10 minutes of your time, I'm telling you, 8 minutes of that is your fault. 8 minutes, because you know why? Because you can't get any more time. You will never get the time back that you allow people to waste in your life. And that's why you got to be a good steward of your time. You can make more money, but you can't make more time. And so you never forget your first moments of something that is special in your life. There's something that I love about first moments, because they create a deep impression in us. You just don't forget that. I mean, your first win. I don't care what it is, if it was a basketball game, if it was a race that you had with somebody, your first win, your first competition that you got in, your first win turns a minute into a moment. Your first win, it turns a minute into a moment. We're talking about how you can turn your minutes into moments. Your first win turns a minute into a moment. Your first kiss turns a minute into a moment. Everybody remembers who their first kiss was. Everybody. You may not have enjoyed it, but but you remember who gave you your first kiss. I'm not talking about mama. your first child turns a minute into a moment. The first time, your first child, it turns a minute into a moment. The first time you hear the voice of God turns a minute into a moment. The first time that God uses you to do something, whether he speaks through you or heals through you or encourages somebody through you, the first time that God uses you, it turns a minute into a moment. The first time that you experience God's blessing in your life, the first time that you experience the favor of God in your life, it turns a minute into a moment. Isn't it interesting how Jacob wrestled with God, and at that moment it changed his life forever. At that moment changed his life forever when Jacob wrestled with an angel. And let me say this to you, that the stories of the Bible do not always show us how we should live, but in fact it shows us something about the authentic presence of our daily experience and the stuff that God uses to work out his purposes of salvation in us and in the world. We in fact are not always being led to see God in our stories, but to see our stories in God. You know why? Because God is the bigger entity. It's not always about seeing God in your story, it's about seeing yourself in God and in the affairs that he has already designed, because God is the larger context and plot into which our stories find themselves. You know, he's the God who was, is, and is to come. We just come in for a moment, but God was before we were. He was. So it's not that we see God in our story. No, we're in his story. We're in his story. We're just in a few chapters of his story. And so that's what God is doing. He's creating moments in us. And there are times when you have to wrestle with God to have a defining moment. You have to wrestle with God about who you are, about why you are, about whether you stay or whether you go. There's some time that you will wrestle over some things that will become a defining moment for you. It's a defining moment. It blasts you out of just living a mediocre life, and then meaning and purpose and fulfillment and joy and enthusiasm and passion comes into you because you've had a defining moment that I know why I'm here. That's a defining moment. And everybody in this world will reach a point in their life where they're trying to do something that they feel that God told them to do, and it will seem as though it is impossible. And then we have to acknowledge that we cannot do it without God's help. We'll say, God, I need you. You can't raise your family without God. Your children will go crazy and lose their minds, and you need God to be able to be there when they get grown enough to leave out of your presence, and then they've got technology in their hands that can allow the world to have access to your babies. You've got to depend upon God. God can still work even when we don't understand what he is doing. He's still at work. God is still at work even when we don't know and understand what he's doing. Because you see, you have to understand that everything that God gives to you, God gives it to you in a raw state. Everything that God gives to you, he gives it to you in a raw state. And so you have to take the raw materials that God has given you and turn them into unforgettable moments. You've already got the raw materials. You ask God for bread, God gives you seed. He gives seed to the sower, seed to the sower, seed to the sower. And the sower does not get bread until he sows the seed and reaps the harvest and makes the bread. Bread is always made by process. Process. Say process. There is no progress without process. There's no progress without process. It's a process. It's a process. And it's your responsibility to be able to discover and to develop the raw materials that God has given to you to be able to turn something unforgettable into those things. It's amazing, you know, whenever I speak, I am taking the raw material of words and producing the revelation of God by what God places in my heart. He just gives me raw material, raw material, raw material. You know, my great-granddaddy, who was a preacher, and one preacher stood up and said, you just open your mouth and the Lord will fill it. And my great-granddaddy said, God might give you the words, but it takes some education to spit them out. And it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing that God gives you stuff in its raw state. Every gift that God gives has the capacity of being developed. And it's our responsibility to develop it. Don't give God the raw materials back in the same form that He gave it to you. Develop it into something. Develop it into something. When you do that, you turn a minute into a moment. You see, there's sometimes that God will let the whole world look like it's turning dark on you. You know why? Because the darkness of night obscures the earth, but it reveals a universe. It obscures the earth, but it reveals a universe. Listen, whenever things start getting dark in your life, open your eyes and look up. Open your eyes. Whenever things start getting dark in your life, open your eyes and look up, because it's in the darkness that it has the greatest capacity to become your defining moment. A person could be going through a divorce, and right in the midst of the darkness of that, they can be going through a tragic illness. And right in the midst of the darkness of that, a whole new universe opens up. They can lose their house or lose their car or lose their job or lose their reputation. And in the darkness of that, God opens up another universe. Because when you get down to nothing, God's up to something. And just when everything else, because we're so earth focused, and God purposefully turns the light off on the earth so that it reveals what's there. The stars are there in the daytime, you just can't see them until the lights go out. What is God hiding from you in the light? And He lets darkness, storms, come into your life to reveal a dimension of the massiveness and the awesomeness of God that you've never seen before. So don't curse because the sun looks like it's going down. When it goes down, it's to reveal a bigger universe than what you see while the light is on. And that's why we don't go by this temporal stuff that you can see, which is always temporary, but the stuff that you cannot see, that is eternal. I want to encourage you, create some moments. Create some moments. Create some moments. And when you create the moments, begin with the end in mind. Begin with the end in mind. And start with this question: how do I want to be remembered? How do I want to be remembered? Begin with the end in mind and start with this question: how do I want to be remembered? How do I want to be remembered? I love something that Walt Disney said. He said, laughter is timeless, and imagination has no age, and dreams are forever. Dreams are forever. Dreams are forever. Imagination has no age, and laughter is timeless. Sometimes, we get some of our greatest wisdom from the simplicity of life. Dr. Seuss said that sometimes you'll never know the value of a moment until it becomes a memory. You'll never know the value of a moment until it becomes a memory. Reg Sandler said that most people will never accomplish the long-term great because they settle for the short-term good. You got to be able to create some moments. Are you willing to create some moments? What are you waiting for to create moments? What are you waiting for to create moments? Because you're only one decision away from a totally different life. You're only one decision away from a totally different life. Because all change begins with a decision. Change begins with what you believe and what you decide. Change begins with what you believe and what you decide. That's when it began. It begins with what you believe and what you decide. Because almost every successful person begins with two beliefs. Number one, that the future can be better than the present. And number two, that I have the power to make it so. Because if you don't feel that there's anything that you can do about it, it won't get done. Remember Joshua 1:8, this book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night, that thou mayest observe to do according to all that is written therein, and then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Sometimes, you know, we try to turn things over and leave all of the responsibility up to God. You pray like it's all left up to God, but work like it's all left up to you. And realize that every successful person begins with those two beliefs, that the future can be better than the present, and I have the power to make it so. Well, let me say this to you very clearly and unequivocally, that without God, your future is just a repeat of the past. Without God, your future is just a repeat of the past. And remember this, that your outer world follows your inner world. Your outer world follows your inner world. What do I mean by that? I mean that when you have peace in your heart, you'll have peace in your life. I mean that when you have confusion in your mind, you'll have turmoil in your life, because your outer world follows your inner world. Your outer world follows your inner world. That's why when God is dealing with you, He doesn't start in your outer world. He starts in your inner world. In your inner world. And that's why, that you prosper even as your soul, the inner world, prospers. You can't prosper in the outer world until you prosper in the inner world.
Thank you for watching Power for Living with Bishop Dale C. Bronner. Join us again next time for Power for Living, where revelation is power. Power for living.